Brian, when I was a kid, and I realize that's getting to be quite a few years ago now, when I was a kid, guys said, you know what, the best thing about having alfalfa in the rotation is we're gonna cut it several times throughout the year, and that'll take care of the weeds. We'll just keep cutting, cutting as those weeds come up, and they're annual weeds, they'll never have a chance to get to seed.
Yeah, but the problem with that is if all those weeds get established, then how much alfalfa is really there when you're cutting it, and what's the quality of that alfalfa? And besides that, if you're going to go out and spray weeds at the same time, you can spray insects, and that's what we find a lot of guys doing. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about spraying in alfalfa, weeds and insects, and I suppose, Darren, we should also probably mention fertilizer or plant growth hormones, that kind of thing.
Oh boy, now we're getting deep. I don't know if we got enough time in a half-hour show for all that,
yeah,
Brian.
But we don't have a lot of choices for herbicide. I mean, name all the products you can think of that you would actually use in alfalfa for herbicides.
All right, now if we're seeding new alfalfa, we can add a couple of products in there, but let's just say that you're starting from scratch.
So like Eptam?
Yeah, let's say that we're going to use something pre-emerge, and some guys will say, well, can't I use a cut rate of Treflan? I say, well, you probably could get away with it if it's on the label, but the one you really want to use is Eptam. If you're using Eptam, you can use a good strong rate of Eptam. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, than using a Treflan or something like that.
But it's a lot safer to the crop and very broad spectrum.
So you're going to get a lot of weeds. Now, here's the one thing with Eptam that I'll say. It has to be instantly incorporated. It has a very high vapor pressure, so when you're putting it on, we prefer to have those spray nozzles right on the front end of your tillage tool. That way it's instantly incorporated in the ground. You don't lose any of the Eptam. Now, the other thing is, if you're going to have alfalfa out there for 3 years, 4 years, whatever the case may be, this is your one shot to get a good stand established. That's why using that pre-emerge herbicide is so important.
Okay, so Darren, you totally avoided my question. I want to hear you list all the products you can.
Now?
I want to hear all the products that you can possibly think of that you'd actually use in alfalfa.
All right, well, let's talk about broadleaves.
No,
well,
you could
just
list them, Darren. Okay, what do you got?
Well, I don't know. With broadleaves, you could use Buctril.
Yep.
You could use Pursuit or Raptor.
Yep.
You could use 2,4-D-B, which would be Butarac.
At a very low rate, maybe an ounce, maybe 2 at the very most, but even that's pushing it.
Okay.
And then what else you got other than that?
Well, Chateau. Yes, you could use Chateau.
Yeah,
you can't use Valor, but you can use Chateau in a dormant situation.
Yeah, there again. So when we start talking about Chateau, it's pushing it. I'd rather rip up the stand.
Well, there are certainly some weeds out there where they would come in handy and are a nice thing in the toolbox. Then the other thing is, if you've got some grass out there. Now, some of the grass is self-induced because there's still a number of guys that want to seed some oats with the alfalfa when they do it, and that's fine. You can do that, but you're going to have to eventually kill that, or if you have some foxtails or some other grass in there.
So any of those grass products, Select Max, and I mean, there are a bunch of different grass products. Just make sure you find one that's labeled in your area.
Okay, and that's about the longest we can turn that discussion into because there really aren't so many choices.
Okay, so let's get specific now. Why would you use Buctril instead of Pursuit or Raptor?
Well, Buctril is a better choice, in my opinion, on lamb's quarters than what Raptor is. Raptor's not bad, but Buctril is better.
Yep.
Also, if you've got some of the large-seeded broadleaf weeds, like cockleburr, sunflower, you could use either Pursuit or Buctril, but Buctril's going to be way cheaper, so why would you not do that? So I like Buctril in that it's a quick burn and it's very inexpensive.
Yep, but what are the advantages of the Pursuit and Raptor?
Well, Pursuit and Raptor have a little bit of residual control.
Yep.
So when you put out Buctril, it just works right that day, and then the next day stuff could pop up. With Pursuit and Raptor, you're going to get a pretty good deal. Maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's 3 weeks, depending on your soil pH.
Well, it'll last in the soil a lot longer than that, but he's talking about for 100% weed control 2 or 3 weeks. But you can get some weed killing power out of it. It's not going to be perfect, but you'll get some weed killing power out of it for several months.
Now the problem is none of these products control thistles. And when you've got some thistles that are popping up in your alfalfa, the last resort is you say, well, I'm going to do some Buctril and I'm going to heat it up as if Buctril isn't hot enough on its own. I'm going to heat it up with some 2,4-D-B or Butarac. And you can put in just a very low rate, maybe an ounce, something like that. And it heats it up and it makes me nervous and all that. You can burn back those thistles a little bit and hopefully your alfalfa comes along and chokes it
When
out.
you mention thistles, that's where I think right away of Roundup Ready Alfalfa and how nice that is. The Roundup Ready Alfalfa, you can use Roundup to control dandelions and to control thistles. It's great. But you know what? I'm telling you, I just read something this morning. Yeah, I mean, I occasionally will read some of these people who call themselves environmentalists. I'm going to disagree with that a little bit. But anyway, people who call themselves environmentalists, and I'm telling you, the venom that they are spewing about Roundup Ready alfalfa, my goodness, I mean, it's just mean.
Well, okay,
So-
I want to talk about thistles because we happen to be standing right in the spot where my great uncle 20 years ago was talking to Brian and me. We're out here trying to control some weeds and soybeans, and he said, well, boys, I fought those thistles for 40 years. Now it's your turn. And within 5 years, Brian and I had them completely wiped out. There's not a thistle to be found on the place. The reason was Roundup Ready crops. And like Brian said,
we also
Roundup,
used Stinger, and that was a big advantage that we had.
that's
But
a help in the
unfortunately,
corn,
Stinger
yes.
will kill alfalfa.
Yeah, but Roundup Ready soybeans are really where we turn things around. And like you say, with Roundup Ready alfalfa, it makes weed control pretty easy. There are a number of weeds we can control. Yes, it won't be perfect. Yes, there will be Roundup resistant weeds that will eventually find their way into the rotation, but it's definitely help on perennials.
All right, let's get to that other stuff. So we're going to have to go quickly. Insecticides, what would you use and when would you spray?
Well, typically we're using a pyrethroid insecticide. We like to spray
Cheap.
early in the season, and also the top producers, they're spraying almost every cutting.
Because it's $1.50 to $2 an acre.
Scout the fields first. If there's no bugs, absolutely do not spray insecticide. But if there are bugs out there, harmful ones like alfalfa weevil larvae on that first cutting, and you get into some other bugs as you go later, but alfalfa weevil larvae are big ones right now, get them sprayed. They really hurt your stand. They really hurt the quality of your stuff.
Foliar feeding. Don't mix fertilizer with Bucktrill, but why should you use, let me first say that.
Well, that's
but,
easy.
But other than that, why would you use a foliar fertilizer?
Well, there are other guys that like to put on fertilizer after every cutting, especially the high producers, because think of all that nutritional value that's leaving your soil every time you haul a cutting of hay off. That's why the feed value is so high. So keep that in mind. Get a better start. You know, the key to having good alfalfa is getting good regrowth after each cutting. Whether it's bugs or lack of fertility, those two things really hold you back. So take care of that. Put a pyrethroid out. Kill some bugs. Maybe use a different mode of action
How
if
about
you need
plant
it.
growth hormones? What do you think of them?
Well, I haven't seen enough data because we don't have alfalfa on the farm anymore. We haven't had alfalfa for a few years. I can't give you firsthand, this is our farm experience, but what we're hearing from growers around the country is they are getting a boost off that. They are seeing more tonnage off that. As far as the feed value goes, that's yet to be determined. But if you're getting more tonnage off it and a little quicker regrowth, that could be a good thing too.
So what we're saying is you may consider experimenting with some plant growth hormones. We definitely feel that using a good herbicide and insecticide program, that is a no-brainer. And then also you're going to want to consider different foliar fertilizers depending on which nutrients you're removing and how many tons of hay you're cutting off each time.
Well, there's certainly a lot of things to think about in alfalfa. One of them is weed control, as we mentioned today. If you have our Weed of the Week, we'll show you how to control that coming up later in the show.